How's it going, everybody? Today I want to try to show you how you can make this, what I've been calling psychedelic color shift effect in Substance Designer. Now we're not going to be focusing on any of the image itself, we're just going to be focusing on how we can animate this cool little color transition. Now you can see here in Substance Player that I can change the speed, as that's an exposed parameter. I can randomize the seed to give it a new starting point. And overall, we just get some really cool effects by having this color shift here. So I'm going to show you how to make that. I also want to talk a little bit about why I think Substance Designer is a really powerful tool for animation, especially something like this where it might not be, your typical style of animation, but rather animating different effects. I got some different things here that I've been playing around with, and this is a product that I have for sale on Gumroad too, but I'll talk more about that later. These are just some examples of some really cool effects that you can get with not a ton of work in Substance Designer. And these are things that you can just easily apply as one node to any image that you have and be able to get that same output with that same effect. So let's jump into the project. This is what I'm currently working with. This is all of the effects done and packaged together. And we're going to be looking at this psychedelic color shift. There's the output, and here's the node itself. Over on the left bar here, we can open up that node and see what is actually making that run. So here we have the input and the output, and in between there's two different nodes. One of them is a jump shift psychedelic, which is an option that you have when you use this node. We're not going to be jumping into that one much because it was pretty much, I broke the original one that I was trying to make on accident, but I still thought it looked cool, so I kept it around as a secondary option. We're going to be looking at this psychedelic color shift. Now down here you can see that both of these instance parameters are exposed. So those are controlled by these graph functions. Now both source color and target color have the same thing. Essentially what this is doing is this is taking the RGB channels and it's giving it a pseudo random color that it slowly switches between. You'll see there's quite a bit of nodes here, but a lot of these are duplicated so that way the R, G, and B can all have unique values. But we're going to cover this starting with setting the speed, setting a variation for the speed, setting a random starting point along the color wheel so that way it doesn't always begin in the same place, and then also giving it that smooth transition so that way it doesn't keep jumping back and forth, which was the issue that I had when I made this jump shift psychedelic. So that's the high level overview of what we're going to be making today. Let's jump into it. So we're back here in the gallery, which is pretty much our main hub for manipulating these effects and kind of playing around with them and making whatever we want out of them. And I've gone ahead and I have created this new output node, a replace color node, which is where we're going to be doing all of the work inside of, and then I've grabbed another copy of one of these images, which was just created by an AI, so no work that I've done on that. And then also I've created a new parameter here in the project so that way we have a speed value that we can manipulate once we take this outside anywhere else as an SBSAR file. So let's go ahead and play around with this replace color a little bit and see what it does. So we can change the source color, and that seems to be turning whatever source color it is to a different shade of grayscale. This target color is gray, so as we change that, we can see that the color shift gets a little bit more dynamic there. So what we want is a way that we can just animate this so that way it picks and slowly cycles through random RGB values at a slow rate that doesn't necessarily like jump around or like reset or anything like that. Just a nice slow transition for both of these values so that way we can get some cool combinations, making our image look a little bit more spectacular. So let's jump in and do that. First thing we want to do is turn this source color into an empty function, and we're going to end up doing it with both, but we really just want the same function in there, so we're just going to start with this one. it says down here that the expected output type is a float3. So we're going to make sure that the final output node is a float3, which is essentially 3 decimal values like stacked on top of each other, which would be R, G, and B in this case. Substance Designer wants these values to be between 0 and 1. If it's outside of that, then our image is pretty much just going to go black, so we want to try to avoid that at all costs. So the first thing we're going to do is create the output so that way it can all bundle together. And what we want to do is use a vector float3. That's going to allow us to put 2 nodes together, either 2 floats, put that into a vector float3 with an empty one, or in the top one we can put a vector float2. So now we have 3 total inputs, R, G, B. So the first one we're going to want to worry about is just that R1, because everything else is going to follow. It's going to be essentially the same code that we end up putting in there. So we'll put this vector float3 as the output node, and we will start working. The first thing we want to do here is make sure that everything is just moving along with time. So we'll add a get float node, and Substance Designer has pre-built in here this time, which will automatically play once you bring it over to Substance Player. So we're going to grab that. So if we were just to plug that straight into the red value, you can imagine that it would start at no red and then start working its way up until there's maximum red at 1 second, and then it's just going to essentially give us a black screen because we're over our bounds. But we're not going to worry about that right now. We're just going to worry about the speed. From what I've played around with before, it seems like just running it through time is a little fast, so we want to divide it by a standard amount just by default. So we're going to divide it by 10, so that way it runs at 1/10 the speed of what it would otherwise, which is very quick. That's within 1 second you've covered the entire color spectrum, which is way too fast for us. So we're just going to divide time by a float. Now the next thing we want to do is be able to give the user control for their inputted speed. So we'll take this new time, which has been standard to be a little bit slower, and we're going to multiply that by this speed value that we defined before, and that'll be exposed so that way we can play with that in Substance Player or anywhere else that we end up taking this file. So now that we've got that together, we can essentially run this animation at a user-defined speed. You know, if it's like 0.5, it's going to be half speed. If it's 2, it's going to be double speed, which is pretty nice. Another thing that I want to do is give a little bit of randomization to the speed, and I want that for each channel. So what I can do then is multiply this again, and I am going to multiply it by a random value, and I'll use random uniform AB. That's going to give us the choice to put in 2 float values here, and it's going to give us a random value between those 2 floats. So in this case, we'll try 0.5 and 1. So now the animation is going to play at some range between 0.5 and 1 of the original speed, and that's going to be for each RGB channel. So every time we're going to get a very different animation because different channels are going to be moving at different speeds, and personally that's something that I like. It might not be something that you would want to implement though if you're looking for absolute consistency with this effect. Alright, so now that we've got that set up, we want to make it so that way our node doesn't just start off at the same color scheme every time. If we give it a random value or a random seed, we want to make sure that we're actually getting a random starting point back. Again, like I said before, it has to be between 0 and 1, so if you cycled over and added 1, then that's, you know, should essentially add like all the way up to the next of the same color, you know, if we clamp it that way. So to get the entirety of the color range, we just have to add a random value between 0 and 1, and that's going to give us a completely random starting point every time. So we'll use that same uniform value node. We'll copy these here. And then we'll set, instead of 0.5, we'll have 0. So that way it covers the entire range of colors, and it'll give us a completely random starting point every time. Now this next little bit that I'm going to do is kind of complicated, so I'm going to show you in a graphing calculator how I would go about doing this. We'll erase this here because that gives away a little bit too much. But right now we have something like this, where as time goes on, there's just going to be a linear relationship, and eventually it's just going to keep running right past the value of 1, which is our clamp, and then everything's going to go black. That's not what we want. Instead, what we want to do is have it smoothly transition back and forth. Now, what we could do, I guess, that's not something I guess this graphing calculator has, but if we wanted to do like a modulus of it where, like, you know, once it hits 1 then it's going to go back to 0 and start climbing, that would keep it between 0 and 1, but the problem is then we're going to get this really jumpy effect, and it's not going to work the way we want it to, because it's going to just go back to 0 and there's going to be this big quick transition which is going to look really ugly. So we want a way that we can make this a nice, smooth, slow transition. So we'll try taking the sine of x. Now if you remember, sine is going to be just a slow wave function, and as you can see, if we were to map along this timeline here, with the x values being in seconds, then, you know, like at 2 seconds, you know, we're still under 1, and, you know, 10 just a little bit under 0. Which is better than what we had before, because it's now it's not just running off to infinity, it's staying somewhere manageable. That being said, we don't want it to be giving us back these negative values, because, you know, that's not very helpful at all. That's still going to be black for half the time on the screen. So we need to be able to clamp that. So we can multiply this by 0.5, and you can see that that made the whole sine wave half as tall, which is perfect, because now the entire height of it is, you know, 1 unit long. Although it's still centered around 0, which is not great, so we're going to want to add to this entire sine function 0.5. Let's put an addition sign in there. So you can see now we have this sine curve, this sine wave, which is nicely moving up and down, hitting 1, hitting 0, and slowly coming back. This will keep our animation from being jumpy and all over the place, and it'll give us something nice and smooth to look at. So let's go ahead and add this to Substance Designer. So right now we have this linear function which is coming out of everything we've just made. Let's make that not linear by just adding sine. So now this is going to take the sine of what we've created over here, and to be able to get this in the right range, we want to first multiply sine by a float of 0.5. And then we want to add another 0.5 to this sine. So now this is going to give us a nice, slow, smooth transition between all of this. And we can just plug this in to the R value. Now, I'm going to just copy and paste everything that we've already created, because I want these random values to be the same. So that's why I'm not going to just grab this and put it in RGB, because that's not going to give us a different random value for each channel, which is something that we want. So I'm going to copy this, and we'll do that twice, and that's alright that it's taking this same user inputted initial time, because nothing is randomized within there. So then we'll grab these new channels and put them into G and B. We'll save this file. We'll go back to the gallery. I guess before we do that, we should also copy this whole node setup. And in the replace color, we also want the target color to be able to do the exact same thing. So we'll empty that function, paste it in, See, this looks a lot more impressive than it is. But yeah, we'll paste that in, and we'll set that as the output node, and we'll save this whole thing. And then we'll go up here and we will republish this SBSAR, so that way we can refresh it and view it in Substance Player. Just give it a second while it publishes this. It's got a lot of different effects in here, so it takes a little bit of time. Nice, that's done. Here we are in Substance Player, and if it doesn't crash for me, we'll refresh that. Alright, we'll stop this animation, go back to the start, and you can see in Gallery, it's not going to be in Psychedelic Color Shift, it's going to be, all the exposed parameters are going to be viewed from Gallery. You can see that we have this speed parameter, and we also have the random seed. Let's try randomizing it. You can see that works well. Every time we click it, we get a really cool, different colored version of this. And then if we go ahead and play this, then you can see that it very slowly is transitioning colors. Oh, no, it's not transitioning colors because the speed's at 0. If we up the speed, though, you can see that it does begin to transition colors the way we'd expect it to. We can increase the speed so that way it's just jumping around, pretty much disco lighting here. But that is the gist of this effect. You can use this same technique to create all sorts of different effects. Like I showed you before, there's a bunch of different cool things in here that I was able to do using more or less this same technique, just obviously using different nodes and mapping things differently. But I think, you know, this video is designed to give you all of the tools that you can go out and do that on your own. So that's all I got to show you today, guys. I hope you were able to follow along, and I hope this was helpful. If you're looking for some other resources on how to animate things in Substance Designer, check out my channel. I've got all sorts of other videos on there, and I'm planning on making more so that way you guys can get familiar with this, because I think this is something that's a really underrated feature of Substance Designer, and just animation as a tool in general. Also, this library that I've been playing around with in here, where it's got all these different effects, is available on Gumroad, and it would be huge if you could support me by purchasing this product, playing around with it, and, you know, making some of your own cool animated effects out of this. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to have that interaction as I try to grow my channel and bring you guys this content on, you know, how to do something cool and unique in Substance Designer. So thank you all for watching. Have a great one.